The Royal African Company transported more than 100,000 enslaved Africans in less than 40 years, more than any other company in history. Not an empire, not an army. A corporation headquartered in London, with shareholders, and a monogram branded into the skin of the enslaved people it transported. This company was founded in 1672 by a charter from King Charles II of England. Within 2 decades, it controlled the labor supply for the entire English-speaking Americas. And the men who profited most from it were not merely merchants, they were the Lords Proprietors, the same noblemen who founded South Carolina and handed it over to the cultivation of a grain most of them had never touched with their own hands. Because the rice that built Charleston did not belong to the Western world. The knowledge that made that colony function came from 700 miles of African coastline that Europeans called the Rice Coast. And the system that exploited that knowledge lasted 200 years, generated immense fortunes, and was called by its own beneficiaries a gold mine. If this kind of history interests you, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, did you know that American rice was cultivated using stolen African knowledge? In 1666, 6 years before South Carolina existed as a functioning colony, brokers in London were already promoting rice as a commercial resource of the Carolinas. That was no accident. The colony was conceived as a commercial venture from the very first document that created it. The 8 men who received from King Charles II a land grant in North America were known as the Lords Proprietors. They were not adventurers or settlers. They were aristocrats and merchants who saw the New World as an opportunity for passive income. Several of them held direct stakes in the Royal African Company, the company that Charles II himself had created to monopolize the Atlantic slave trade. The same king who issued the RAC's charter issued Carolina's charter. The same men who profited from transporting enslaved Africans were the same men who needed labor in the new colony. That was not a coincidence. It was architecture. The first settlers arrived in 1670 on the banks of the Ashley River. Many of them came from Barbados, an overcrowded island where the sugar economy was already saturated and where plantation culture was so deeply embedded that it traveled with the luggage. They brought enslaved people, they brought the model, and they brought the ambition to find a commodity that could rival West Indian sugar. The problem was, they did not know what to plant. Tobacco, indigo, forest products, everything was tested. Nothing generated the returns those men wanted. And then, in 1685, a merchant ship in distress docked in Charleston and paid for repairs with a small quantity of seeds from Madagascar. A colonist named Henry Woodward planted those seeds, and the rice grew. By 1698, 10,000 pounds of rice had been exported. By 1699, 130,000 pounds. By 1700, 395,000 pounds. In 3 years, production had multiplied nearly 40 times over. By 1700, there was more rice waiting on the docks of Charleston than there were ships to carry it. This should be a story of agricultural success. But there was a fundamental problem that the documents of the era record with a disturbing clarity. European colonists did not know how to grow rice. They did not know how to drain swamps. They did not know how to build dikes. They did not know how to control tidal flow. They had no tradition whatsoever with that grain. But they knew of a place where all of that knowledge had existed for millennia. West African farmers had been cultivating Oryza glaberrima, African rice, for at least 3,000 years before Europeans reached that coast. When the first Portuguese explorers arrived in Guinea in 1446, they found extensive rice fields already established. Populations in the inner delta of the Niger River had domesticated rice varieties across radically different environments: arid lands, wetlands, floodplains, tidal zones. They knew how to irrigate, drain, and control water with hydraulic structures built from hollow tree trunks. that knowledge was not primitive. It was sophisticated enough that South Carolina planters made a deliberate choice. They began specifying where they wanted their enslaved people to come from. The records are explicit. Plantation owners requested Africans from what was called the Grain Coast, the region that today comprises Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Slave ship captains knew that if they fed Africans captured from that coast with rice during the crossing, they would be less likely to rebel. Rice was familiar. It was home. It was the only point of human contact on a journey designed to dehumanize, and traders charged more for those Africans. The market priced knowledge. An African from the Guinea coast with experience in rice cultivation was worth more at a Charleston auction than any other. Planters knew they were buying not just labor, they were buying generations of accumulated agricultural expertise, knowledge of hydraulics, the ability to read tides and soil. And they paid accordingly. This is what some historians call the industrial-scale theft of knowledge. But the mechanism of accumulation did not stop there. Because rice does not grow on its own in the South Carolina lowlands, it requires infrastructure. And that infrastructure was built entirely by hands that received nothing in return. What the enslaved Africans found in South Carolina were not ready-made fields. They were dense swamps infested with cypress and tupelo trees, filled with venomous snakes, alligators, rats, and mosquitoes carrying malaria. To plant rice, one first had to transform that land, drain it, clear it, level it, and then build a water control system that rivaled in complexity the engineering works of contemporary Europe. More than 40,000 acres were cleared. 780 miles of canals were dug. By some estimates, more than 236,000 acres of the South Carolina coast were transformed by that labor. Dikes, dams, wooden floodgates called trunks, structures that allowed the fields to be flooded and drained according to the tidal cycle. The tidal fields were called, without irony, by the experts of the era, the most engineered and most valuable agricultural sites in the world. All of it built with rudimentary tools. All of it built by people who had not chosen to be there. The question the documents raise, and that no proprietor of that era ever answered publicly, is simple. Without African knowledge, would this system have existed? The answer is in the planters' own records. Some contemporary scholars argue that the early Carolina farmers learned to cultivate rice in swamps directly from their enslaved African workers. Not the other way around. Knowledge did not flow from master to laborer. It flowed from laborer to master, and the master absorbed it as property. And as that system consolidated, the numbers became incomprehensible. By 1720, rice was already the most valuable export commodity of the lowcountry. By 1747, it represented 55% of the total value of South Carolina's exports. By 1765, there were more than 90,000 enslaved people in the colony, and roughly 40,000 tons of rice were exported per year. By the early 1770s, annual exports through Charleston fluctuated between 60 and 70 million pounds. Total American exports exceeded 80 million pounds annually. Charleston became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Indigo, cotton, timber, nothing came close. The planters themselves said their plantations generated profit margins of up to 26%. They called them gold mines. But there was something they did not say out loud. The mortality rate of South Carolina's enslaved population exceeded the birth rate. Unlike other North American colonies, where the enslaved population grew naturally, here it had to be constantly replenished with new Africans. The swamps were lethal. The work was lethal. The conditions were designed to extract the maximum from a human body before it gave out. Women were forced to pound rice with wooden mortars for 16 hours straight. Some died of exhaustion inside the barns. Records show that other enslaved people burned those barns in response, an act of resistance that the documents call sabotage, and that any reasonable person would call something else entirely. Malaria was endemic. Enslaved Africans arrived carrying a virulent strain of Plasmodium falciparum that killed a large portion of European colonists and English indentured servants. Africans had limited resistance, a legacy of the sickle cell trait and prior exposure to the disease. But limited resistance is not immunity. They also fell sick. They also died. In numbers that proprietors calculated as an operating cost, by 1708, the demand for labor was so intense that South Carolina came to have a majority black population, a condition that lasted with fluctuations until the Great Migration of the early 20th century. In the 18th century, more than 50% of the lowcountry's population was enslaved Africans. Around 9% were enslaved Native Americans, Kiowa, Stono, Edisto, Cherokee, Tuscarora, and Yamasee peoples. The white population was a minority in a land it claimed to control. That imbalance generated fear, and fear generated violence. In 1739, the Angolan majority of South Carolina revolted. The Stono Rebellion was the largest slave revolt in the American South up to that point. Africans who attempted to reach Fort Mose in Florida, where a Spanish fort offered freedom. The rebellion was suppressed with extreme violence. In response, the colony banned African drums. It reduced the importation of Africans from Central Africa. It attempted to sever the cultural ties that made collective resistance possible. The problem is that those ties ran deeper than any law could reach. Because in the Sea Islands and the mainland enclaves of the Lowcountry, isolated by swamps and tides, the enslaved Africans and their descendants created something no proprietor had planned for: a culture. The Gullah Geechee people forged the only English-based Creole language in North America. They created a cuisine that descends directly from West Africa. The same okra, the same red rice, the same soup still prepared today in Sierra Leone under identical names. They preserved rice processing techniques, basket weaving, music, and spirituality that survived 200 years of systematic suppression. Jack McCrae, a journalist who grew up in downtown Charleston in the 1950s, stated that he had learned English as a second language in elementary school. His first language was Gullah, well into the 20th century. That is the paradox the system could never resolve. The same isolation that made exploitation possible also made cultural preservation possible. The planters built a world where African people were surrounded by water and swamp, and that same enclosure protected what they most wanted to destroy. And then the Civil War came, and the system collapsed. But the story of rice and power does not end in 1865. Because the pattern the Lords Proprietors established in South Carolina, taking agricultural knowledge from communities that had developed it over generations, transforming it into a commodity, and using legal systems to ensure the profit went to those who had produced nothing, that pattern did not disappear. It grew more sophisticated. On September 2, 1997, a company called RiceTec registered patent number 5663484 with the United States Patent Office. RiceTec was a company from Alvin, Texas, with 120 employees and an annual revenue of approximately $10 million. Its owner was Count Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein. The patent claimed, in 20 clauses, the originality of its basmati rice lines, a hybrid derived from Indian and Pakistani varieties crossed with American long-grain rice. With that patent, RiceTec obtained a monopoly over the cultivation of its variety throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. Basmati is a rice cultivated for centuries by farmers of the Indian subcontinent. The name is a geographical indication, the way champagne is to French sparkling wine. Patenting it as an American invention is the equivalent of a company registering the name Bordeaux for a wine made in Kansas. India responded with a 3-year legal battle. It submitted to the American Patent Office up to 50,000 pages of documentation, proving that the traditional knowledge and biodiversity associated with basmati had been the heritage of Indian communities for generations. It was not an invention. Under pressure, RiceTec agreed to withdraw 15 of the 20 patent clauses and to remove the term basmati from the title. The victory was partial. The mechanism kept operating. That same mechanism was being applied across Asia. Foreigners controlled more than 70% of agricultural patents in the region. Farmers who had cultivated certain rice varieties for generations found themselves obliged to pay royalties for seeds their grandparents had developed. The WTO's TRIPS Agreement, signed in 1994, provided the legal framework for this transfer of intellectual property from the global south to corporations in the north. The names changed. The Royal African Company became RiceTec. The monogram branded into the skin became a patent clause. The Carolina Swamp became the patent court in Washington. But the structure is the same. Identify where knowledge exists, separate that knowledge from the people who developed it, and use systems of power, legal, economic, political, to transform collective heritage into private property. In Thailand, more than 5 million farmers cultivated jasmine rice, a local variety that American companies were also attempting to register under their own trademark. In South Carolina, more than 40% of all Africans forcibly brought to the United States entered through the port of Charleston. Conservative estimates indicate that 90% of Black Americans have at least one ancestor who passed through that city. And today, the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, stretching across 27 counties from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Jacksonville, Florida, draws millions of tourists who come to see the culture that survived the attempt to erase it. The same culture that was a byproduct of the most profitable system in American colonial history. There is an irony that no official document records, but that the facts make inevitable. Carolina gold, the rice variety that built Charleston's wealth, nearly disappeared after the Civil War. Its last commercial harvest was in 1927. Decades later, a couple from the South Carolina interior became interested in restoring rice ponds on their own property and discovered that a U.S. Department of Agriculture research center in Texas had preserved a stock in its seed bank. And when the couple obtained the first 14 pounds and planted them, they harvested 64 pounds in the first season. The grain came back. The history of what it cost to produce it remains buried under the weight of the fortunes it generated. Every system of extraction requires two elements: a source of value that does not belong to those doing the extracting, and a legal mechanism that makes the extraction legitimate. South Carolina had the Lords Proprietors and the Royal African Company. The modern era has the TRIPS Agreement and patent offices. The mechanisms evolve. The logic remains. If you want to keep understanding how this mechanism repeats itself, under different names, in different centuries, over different resources, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every episode is one piece of that same puzzle. Hit like if this story changed something in your understanding of where wealth comes from. And tell me in the comments, what resource do you think is being extracted this way today?